So for this edition of the Millennium Film Workshop podcast, we are going to do a little road trip. For this episode, we are in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we're going to be attending Experiments in Cinema 13.6. And really what this festival is a celebration of international cinematic experimentation. So please feel free to join us as we conduct this road trip / search for what is an experiment in cinema.
What is an experiment in cinema? In my case, it's almost everything I do. I experiment around. I know that there's a movie in here somewhere, and learning techniques and things to play with it just adds to my repertoire. But what I'm really trying to do is make a movie. And my movies tend to be odd, or the underground, or the experimental. Yes, just as long as you're making a movie, and that's the experiment. You're literally experimenting with your visuals and yourself and your sense of the media.
The way I interpret experiments in cinema is it's poetry through film, because it's really seeing like what you can do with your camera, what you can do with your ideas, and not being overly focused on a beginning, middle, and end, but kind of seeing it as one fluid thing together. And I love that there's no one way for an experiment to be an experiment. It's just you have an idea, you put it in action, and see what happens.
With regards to film festivals, if you're looking for a nice seaside view, you may search for an apartment at the Festival du Camp, or if you would like a nice winter cabin or bungalow, you may go to Park City, Utah. At Experiments in Cinema in Albuquerque, there is the Highway House. It is the sponsoring motel for the festival, and in its own right is a very special experiment. As you drive up to the motel lodge, you see a very iconic neon sign, and it has all the accoutrements that you would expect in a 1950s era sign, including the neon and the bright facade, and of course the color TV at this location. But also special is the quote that it has just below the name Highway House: "Sleep is our business." And as you go into the hotel and check into your room, there's just a few charms that are very specific or unique to the Highway House and the Experiments in Cinema Festival. You have 1950s decor, a very simple room with a table and 2 chairs. This time I was a little amiss because it appears that the Highway House has upgraded to flat screen TVs, and I was really hoping for the large console-style TV to kind of highlight this experience. But really what the Highway House is about is putting your mindset in a different era. When you walk around the Highway House and enter the rooms and spend time in the rooms and just appreciate the visual aesthetic experience of it, you can get a sense of narratives that took place previously, families perhaps traveling to Albuquerque in the 50s and 60s, and this being kind of the marquee location to stop, a very practical experience where you drive all day, get here, and then have this experience where you're just enjoying the nice weather of Albuquerque and all that it has to offer. So if you ever do make it to Experiments in Cinema, you can go to one of the chain hotels and get your modern accommodations there. But I highly recommend you try the Highway House and immerse yourself in one of the experiments of this Experiments in Cinema Festival. So I'm sitting here in a room at the Highway House, and I'm here with Experiments in Cinema founder and director Bryan Konefsky. And today we're going to have a discussion about what is an experiment in cinema. But before we go into that perhaps elongated topic, let's go ahead and hear a little bit about you, Bryan. What is your background and what type of work do you do as it relates to experimental cinema?
Sure. Thanks for having me. And thanks for coming to the festival and being part of it. So I started my creative practice as a painter. And in the 1970s, I remember as an undergraduate, a painting undergraduate, I took a video art course with Shalom Garowitz back in the East Coast. And it changed my world. It was just an incredible experience to have, and that was a video art class. So we're working with electronic media. We're working very much in a tape-based analog environment. And I remember that we would take over this TV studio that was on campus, and we would just try plugging things in ways that they weren't supposed to be, maybe a little bit like, but not nearly as directed, perhaps, or as informed as some of the early work that the Fasulkas did, and maybe along with Namjoon Paik. But that was really, really mind-blowing. And then I took a couple film history courses, and I think I mentioned this at the festival yesterday with George Morris, who was a critic for the Village Voice, and he would come out to Connecticut to teach now and again. And between the two of those experiences, it just changed everything. But then I sort of forgot about the moving image because at that time, equipment was kind of expensive. When I moved out here to New Mexico in 1990, I met Gene Youngblood, and the Fasulkas for that matter. And they reminded me how much I really loved the moving image arts. And by that time, equipment was much less expensive, both film and video equipment. And I picked it up again just immediately, and just almost within a day, just boom, gave up the painting practice. So that is sort of the quick story of how I got involved with the moving image arts. And I think I'm probably the very, very, very last person in the universe who has gotten away with teaching what he's never studied. So I never got a degree in film. I never got a degree in video, but that's what I teach here at the university. And then when I first moved out here, I met Keith Henley, who's the owner of the Guild Cinema, where we stage our festival, Experiments in Cinema. And Keith was the founder of Basement Films, which was a microcinema in its earliest days, and I immediately got involved with them. It felt like coming home in some ways, and got more involved with them through the 90s, and these days I'm the president of that nonprofit. Keith is on our board of advisors, and we've just got a great crew. So as a microcinema, especially in the 1990s, there was this huge burgeoning of microcinemas around the country, around the world. Of course, David Sherman coined the phrase microcinema, and we saw a lot of people, filmmakers, who were touring. So we would have shows almost monthly, and it was fantastic. We'd have great audiences, and it was a real heady time. But I guess I started my festival in 2005, and there were a couple reasons that I started it. One was that we started to see our audiences wane, and fewer filmmakers were touring. And it seemed like the whole microcinema scene was kind of dissolving a little bit. So we thought, well, how can we reinvigorate an audience? And so me and Keith were thinking, if we have a festival that celebrates the stuff that we had been supporting, maybe in a more condensed way, we could reinvigorate a local audience and bring some folks in from outside. And also, Governor Richardson at the time was bringing Hollywood back to New Mexico with tax incentives and such. Of course, Breaking Bad and so many of these different programs were shot and produced here in New Mexico. And that was great in terms of maybe short-term and even maybe long-term economic incentives, economic growth for the state. But the downside of it was that because those big budget films were very much in the media's eye, local newspapers, radio, that sort of thing. Everybody, the conversation around what cinema is started to get a little bit anemic, and in many ways boiled down to, when is Brad Pitt going to be here next? And so Basement Films always has been, and our mission has continues to be, to support what we call underrepresented forms of media through a variety of different activities, workshops, hosting traveling filmmakers, now with our festival, etc. And we thought it was a good time to remind people that there are other histories of cinema that are just as valid, but maybe not as supported financially and not as widely distributed. So for all those reasons, we thought that the festival might be a good idea to do.
I find myself at times hesitating before I call it a festival, the Experiments in Cinema Festival, specifically because you mentioned that this is unfestival-like. It's such a unique and interesting title, Experiments in Cinema, yet it doesn't always have the festival title. Or, for example, this year, Experiments in Cinema version 13.6. Right. And then there's the theme that follows with each year. So can you speak a little bit about the title and what that relationship between the word festival or an unfestival, or I think you mentioned it's undependent, if you will. Let's talk about that a little.
No, and I'm glad you brought that up. That's an interesting point. It's interesting because the term festival is often thought of, as something associated with a Sundance, or something associated with a Cannes Film Festival, or something associated with larger budget kinds of situations. So maybe this is an unfestival. And we're using that term because a friend of mine up in Eugene, Oregon, Mark Moscato, who had a short-lived microcinema, terrific little microcinema called My House, he coined the phrase undependent cinema as opposed to independent cinema. And I like that. And for me, it's personally kind of, it rings a bell because I remember as a kid, you were either a Coca-Cola drinker or you were a 7-Up drinker. And the 7-Up was called the Un-Cola. And so there's a little bit of a childhood resonance for me in that regard. But maybe this is the Un-Festival. For example, many festivals have awards, and we proudly are a non-competitive festival. That being said, of course, there's some competition because if you submit a film, you're either adjudicated in or not into the program. So there is some competition in that regard. But I've designed this festival out of the good, the bad, and the ugly of what I've seen traveling internationally at festivals, and that maybe sounds a little bit like a judgment call, especially the bad and the ugly. And I don't mean it so much. I've seen a lot of great stuff at festivals, but I wanted to create an event that was about nurturing community, that was about sharing, and that was about being as filmmaker friendly as it possibly could. I think those 3 points are really central to how I've developed this event. And a lot of festivals are competitive. There are awards. When it gets to that point, I feel like the awards get to be very subjective and kind of get in the way of nurturing community. It pits people against each other. How come you got an award and I didn't get an award? Kind of thing. In many ways, I see, and we'll get to the definitions, but I see experimental media artists or independent media artists from around the world as being today's version of traveling troubadours. So, of course, a traveling troubadour would go from village to village, sharing the news of the day from their particular corner of the world. And I see that model as being very relevant to maybe think about experimental filmmaking, where somebody from Serbia, somebody from Croatia, somebody from Korea, somebody from Argentina brings a film to our festival, and we get this little insight, this wonderfully personal little insight into how they view the world from their particular corner of the universe. And that view of the world often is a poetic look at, not necessarily a literal look at the news of the day, but sometimes it's that as well, as there are many different iterations of all things experimental.
With regards to an experiment in cinema, how would you define that? What is an experiment in cinema? Not only for those who are arriving to experimental cinema as a new concept, but also those who are seasoned in it.
Sure. That's also a very good question, and also a very difficult question to respond to. I do a lot of outreach programming through Basement Films to different schools around the state, and a lot of that is about middle schools and high schools, and a lot of that is about introducing kids to these alternative cinematic practices, and then inviting them to make something that we then show, which we'll do tomorrow night at our festival at our regional youth program. So it's about, that activity is about inviting kids to recognize the value of their media voices and then to participate as a citizen as opposed to consumer and end user, which we're so often thought about in this country, to participate in shaping future trends of cultural representation. So there's a real, it's not just let's show some kids films, but there's a real strong reason for that. So when I do these outreach presentations, there's a couple ways that I present my sense of all things experimental. One is there's an awful lot of science that goes on in New Mexico. Sadly, some of it has to do with blowing people up with atomic bombs and shit, but other than that. And so as a scientist, so there is a lot of science, and a lot of kids' parents work at the labs, and also there's some familiarity there. So I'll say, well, in the science world, if somebody has an idea that they want to explore, they'll come up with a hypothesis. What might happen if? And then they'll do a series of experiments to see if their idea was had any truth, had any value in it. So the same thing happens, I think, in the art, the world of moving image arts, where a filmmaker, a media artist, a video artist might think about what might happen if. And that what might happen if could take the form of, I'm going to experiment with narrative form. I'm going to experiment with the physicality of the film. I'm going to experiment maybe with some ones and zeros in some freeware, as Paul, you were describing yesterday in your presentation. What might happen if? And if I took that and applied it to this particular project, let's see what might happen. So that's one way of thinking about experimental cinema. And then another way that often works well, especially for students in New Mexico, art students in particular, is I remind them that Georgia O'Keeffe had spent a lot of time here up in Taos back in the 30s. And when she was here, she was experimenting with the relationship between paint and canvas. And she was experimenting not only with those two, the materiality, but experimenting with how we might reimagine a landscape or a still life in that rectangular space of the canvas. And so in a similar way, I think experimental filmmakers experiment with how we might reimagine cinematic form on the big screen, or little screen, or whatever screen is appropriate for the particular project that they're working on.
I can remember in film school the undergraduate experience where we had an opportunity to take our first experimental cinema class, and when we came back to our, quote, regular narrative classes, the professor, feeling maybe slightly threatened, said, I understand there's no rules with experimental, it's cool and everything, but in order to break the rules, you have to learn the rules first. And I always approach that with skepticism. I was like, I think you can be an experimental filmmaker without learning the conventional rules of storytelling or cinema, the conventions or the formulas. And I'm wondering, do you have a take on that? Do you feel you need to learn the rules to break the rules? Or, especially in the case of teaching students or children, can you start them out with an experimental voice or vision?
I think you can. And what you just described sets up, I think, an unfair hierarchy of, well, this is, first you have to learn the rules. Well, who made those rules, and under what conditions, and to what end. Couldn't we just as easily say, well, you have to learn the rules to make experimental cinema before you can go out and make that silly little narrative film?
That's right.
Just switch it
Exactly.
around. And also, another way that I talk about it that maybe sidesteps the rules, and I've got air quotes going on right now, is that, as I described before, I come from a painting background, and my approach to cinema is just as I had a palette of paint, I had a palette of brushes when I was involved in that kind of creative activity. Now I have a palette of cameras, and that's how I refer to it. So, I might have a little pixel vision camera. I might have my Super 8 film camera. I might have a high-end, well, not high-end, but sort of high-end digital video camera. I might have my 16mm 1927 Kodak camera that I use that registers images in particular ways. So depending on the project that I work on, I'll think about that palette of cameras and which combination might express my ideas, illustrate or help me realize my ideas best. So I share that with students often too. But that's an interesting question, and I think it's loaded, and I think sometimes we don't take it apart enough, these rules and who makes them.
You've also had some experience or some interactions with Millennium Film Workshop in the past. I feel like I've seen your name come up in some of the membership lists that I've gone through. And so can you speak a little bit in terms of your relationship to Millennium?
Living on the East Coast, I wasn't going to Millennium regularly, but I would go every now and again. And Howard Guttenplan was so sweet to do a show of my work one night, and that was just such an honor, and it was such a special occasion. He was so warm and generous, and it was just, I can't say enough about that experience. But the journal I've been getting for a long time, and it's definitely informed some of my practice. It's definitely informed some of my teaching. Some of the essays or extracts from them I've used in classes and such. It's an important resource. It's a really, really important resource. The world of all things experimental, the world of all things undependent, is a fairly small world, and that's one of the things that I enjoy about it, that as you travel around the world, everybody seems to know each other or knows of each other in some sorts of ways. It's a wonderful, tight-knit community. And as such, this might sound like an advertisement for Millennium, but we need to support organizations like this. We need to respect, support, and participate because participation is central. Central to my mission as a teacher, central to my mission as a film festival director, to wrestle ourselves away from the viral sense of we are only consumers and end users.
We touched upon the Highway House. We touched upon the Guild Cinema. We touched upon the films and the filmmakers and the community that develops over the course of the festival. Yet one of my favorite parts of the event is the get-together at your house, and it's a gesture that I've never seen in any other festival, going to that extent to invite the members of this community into literally your home space. So could you tell us a little bit about how that transpired, how that originated, and what exactly it is, the festival lunch, if you will?
Sure. And we call it the Filmmakers' Lunch, but it's an important component. There are... One of the reasons for having this festival or this anti-festival or unfestival is to give people an opportunity to share their ideas, not just to watch movies. So a filmmaker will be present, and at the end, and this of course happens at a lot of festivals, we'll invite them to the stage to engage the audience. We don't call it Q&A, we call it thoughtful discussion. And again, that might just be terminology, but I think you being mindful of language, I think, is helpful. And so thoughtful discussion. But some people, maybe are not so prone to asking questions even in what I hope is a fairly comfortable and relaxed environment in the theater. And so by having the filmmakers lunch, it gives people more of an opportunity to meet and greet and discuss and think about some of the programming and such. There's nothing that I like more, nothing I enjoy more than seeing people exchanging phone numbers and let's stay in touch, so glad to meet you, and making a new friend in a sense. And some wonderful examples of that. A couple years ago, Karen Klein, who's here with us this year, and also Taylor Dunn, who's here, met, and I want to say they met at the festival, along with another filmmaker, Linda Fenstermaker. And they met and they really got on, and they proposed curating a program of ovular films. And we did it. And so I love hearing that sort of thing where people meet, they get excited and inspired. In fact, I was so touched. Graham from Millennium, who's here this year, he's been very sweet. And we were talking about how neither one of us submit our own films to many festivals these days. We've ramped down our production, and it feels good. We're doing enough to keep ourselves happy, but we're not as maybe aggressive in submitting to festivals as we used to be. And so Graham was here for a couple days, and yesterday he said, this event is really inspiring. I'm going to submit something next year. And so
great.
Just hearing something like that is just,
You have to describe the trailer
in
the backyard. Because the lunch, it would still be a lunch without the trailer, but the trailer just is the dessert, right?
That's right. It's true. So in my backyard, I have a 30-foot 1950 Spartanet tandem travel trailer. It's not an Airstream, but the Spartan trailer, the Spartan company, which was in existence from, I think, 1946 to 58, was a J. Paul Getty activity, folly, I don't know. And they were designed as starter homes for returning vets. So essentially, Getty had a bunch of aluminum left over at the end of the war, and it was his idea to make essentially Levittown on wheels. And my spouse and I, when we first got it, and I've been renovating it for maybe 13 or 14 years now, when we first got it, we referred to it as our non-gender specific menstrual hut. So whoever needed a moment, we'll go out to the trailer.
Sure.
So that's, the trailer is, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's part of another component of the festival where we have an artist in residence program. This year, Julie Perini from Portland is our resident artist. And they stay in the trailer, and then they work with Basement Films' collection of about 10,000 ephemeral educational films that we have in an archive and a studio about 15 minutes south of the trailer, south of our home. So the resident artist's job is to do some kind of creative research amongst this collection, and the idea is to exercise the collection more. We want more and more artists and people, historians and people in the community to take advantage of this archive. And then they present the results of that creative research at the festival.
Great. Also, that's an incentive to either submit or attend experiments in cinema. So as we wrap up here, would you have anything you would want to share with someone who might be interested in attending the festival, either as a filmmaker or an enthusiast?
Sure. We love seeing submissions from artists and cultural workers that we've never heard of before. Ours is not a festival that shows necessarily the usual suspects. There's some artists whose names you'll recognize that we're exhibiting, but we love to find new stuff and to support whether they're young or they're old or new to the moving image arts. We love to support work that might not otherwise have an opportunity to be screened. Our submission prices are I think, inexpensive, and that's also intentional. So we do $20 a submission. If somebody submits 3 or more works, it goes down to $10 a submission. Once you've screened at our festival, you never pay an entry fee again, and international submissions are always free. So we try to, maybe that's an expression of trying to be as filmmaker friendly as we can.
Well, thank you, Bryan. I think you have to run and do a show now. Is it experiment 7 or 8 or
something like that? Yeah, we call our programs experiments. So I think this might be 7 or 8. And yeah, I've got to go run a film festival. So thanks so much. This is fantastic.
The Millennium Film Workshop would like to thank you for listening to today's podcast. We would also like to thank Bryan Konefsky, Basement Films, Jeff Hudson, and Aisha Hopkins for participating in today's recording. Throughout 2018, Millennium is celebrating MFW 50/50. We are conducting 50 events to celebrate 50 years of nonprofit operation. Details about the events can be found at millenniumfilm.org/MFW 50/50 or at MFW 1966 on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The track "We Always Thought the Future Would Be Kind of Fun" by Chris Zabriskie was used under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license. Chris's additional work can be found at chriszabriskie.com. And finally, the Millennium Film Workshop podcast will return next month. We encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments section of our Facebook post. We also hope you'll consider joining us at an upcoming Millennium event. Thank you.
Thank you.